We're here today to discuss buildings with a complicated history. And we've got an incredible panel of experts here today. We've got Colin Gale from Bethlem, Museum of the Mind, Victoria Northwood from Bethlem as well, Jennifer O'Mahony, who's Senior Lecturer in Psychology in SETU, and of course Denise Murray, who's the Metropolitan Workshop and also CoLab. So I just wanted to really get straight into it and start talking about the title, I suppose, that we're going to discuss today. Do you want to start off with the title there, Victoria, Buildings of Complicated History?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reflecting quite a lot on what complicated might mean. It's quite an interesting choice of words. I think for me, I thought about the complicated history of the Bethlem Museum, but also of the Bethlem Hospital. There have actually been 4 Bethlem hospitals. There were 2 in the City of London. There was then one when there was this sort of move in the 19th century to find spaces for asylum in airy and healthy locations. So the third Bethlem was south of the River Thames in London in what was then St George's Fields, which at that point really were fields. And then there was a further move in the 20th century to another space. So you have these 4 different buildings, 2 of which still exist, 2 of which have been demolished. But then you've also got, alongside that, a concept of Bethlem Hospital, the concept of Bethlem or Bedlam that emerged through literature, through art, as a sort of alternative place for the mad, in the same way that we talk about, a Hoover instead of a vacuum cleaner. The word Bedlam became a shorthand for the madhouse. So when I started working at Bethlem Hospital and said, I'll be working at Bethlem or Bedlam, people looked at me completely blankly because they had no idea that this was a bricks and mortar place. It was so much a place of the imagination, of history, of culture, that there was this sort of lack of understanding that this was also a working National Health Service hospital that continued to have patients in it. So the word complicated, I think, is an interesting one and is going to bring up all sorts of different ideas. I think.
Can you explain a little bit more just for the audience about Bedlam? It was something that I wasn't completely au fait with, and I'm sure lots of people in the room are, but just to extract
in terms
that,
of the concept.
I know those goes back into the history of the word.
Absolutely. So the hospital, it started out, as many places have done, as a religious institution. It was the Priory of St Mary of Bethlehem in the City of London. In reality, nobody could be bothered to say such a long title, so it was shortened to Bethlem. Bethlem became interchangeable with Bedlam. People speak lazily, especially in London. So you had it as a sort of alternative. The 2 were used interchangeably. When the first site of the hospital, the Priory, was still in existence, you started to get the ballads. It became part of ballad culture. It also became referenced in Jacobean drama. You would have these sort of quite dramatic scenes in the Bedlam madhouse. Was this actually the real Bedlam? Was this just a sort of archetype of a madhouse, and Bedlam was the shorthand? It moved again to this sort of very grand and palatial building in Moorfields. Again, fields being the sort of continuing thing, trying to get the green space. But then you have William Hogarth, who depicts the interior of Bethlem as part of his Rake's Progress series of paintings. You have it coming out in Jonathan Swift's Tale of a Tub. And, I mean, Hogarth's depiction is, I think, probably the only actual depiction we have of what the inside of that hospital might have looked like. The outside, I think Colin will correct me if I've got that wrong, but the outside was very widely known. It was depicted. It was on the tourist map of London. People were invited to come and promenade in the gardens, but also up until 1770 to go inside to go and look around. So people were familiar with what the inside of that hospital looked like. So, Hogarth's depiction, we think, is probably, clearly the people within it are not going to be accurate representations. It's a satire, but the space inside the building, we think that's depicted quite correctly. So you have this sort of shorthand of Bethlem for the madhouse, for a place where anything could happen, for noise, for confusion. It's still a term that's used. Oh, it's Bethlem in there,
Yeah.
It's noisy. There's all sorts going on. My house on a average day after school, it's Bethlem. It's become this shorthand, this archetype, which has sort of existed alongside the real bricks and mortar for these hundreds of years.
You were kind of there at the beginning, well, not beginning, but as you said earlier, dwarf standing on shoulders. But
definitely
then,
dwarf.
Colin, you now are the director, and there's been a lot more going on in the Museum of the Mind and complicated histories, building complicated. How do you see it different?
Yeah, that's right. I took over from Victoria. I took over her mantle, and I guess I've had experience in how people on an ongoing basis, visitors, kind of respond to the displays. And I think what the difficulty for Victoria and I, probably not so much for Denise and Jennifer, but we have to keep in our minds that it's about the complicated history of the buildings and not talk too much. I've already promised the chair of the next panel not to talk too much about the difficult objects, which I guess in some ways we could also cover. But Manon's given me permission to, if we could possibly just get up the slide that you had in commenting on those restraints, because I think that there are a couple of examples in that slide that, for me, speak to the symbiotic relationship there is between buildings or places with a complicated history and then objects. So it's and I just want to speak about those as examples. So on the left-hand side there, and maybe it's not altogether straightforward to see, but it is the case that there we've put restraints, shackles, chains, straitjackets on display, but in a way where you have to opt in, And I guess what we're doing is trying to walk a line, which has already been referred to, between two extremes. If sometimes people ask, as the museum visitors, why have you hidden them away? Well, in truth, if we wanted to hide them away, we have a storeroom, and they could have just stayed there, and no one would have ever seen them, right? But then on the other extreme is to think, well, crumbs, we can do something. We can really go to town on this. Exploit the sensationalize these quite confronting and challenging objects, put them front and center, put them on our marketing, and we can have ghost tours and all the rest of it. And what we've tried to do is to walk a line, and in that we were informed by our community consultation, which preceded the curation of the displays, where service users were saying, we want this on display, but we want to also make it possible for someone to navigate through the displays in a way that feels safe to them. And so opting in or opting out. And I'll never forget, actually, we had a team of volunteers working in advance of our reopening in 2015 on basic conservation tasks, cleaning. There was a whole team devoted to simply cleaning sort of some of these sort of handcuffs and chains and things. I'll never forget one service user volunteer coming to us and saying, I love what you're doing. I think I'm all behind the whole concept of the museum, and I'm here to tell you this is my last day of volunteering. I can't do it anymore because it's doing my head in, because these particular objects you've given me to conserve, I can't regard them just as museum objects. To me, I think of the people. I have a visceral connection to the people who are at the sharp end of this. So from that, we learned the need. And I think going back to that issue of the symbiotic, we're on the site of a psychiatric hospital that continues to deliver mental health services. So we feel a deep responsibility to provide displays that our visitors can navigate around safely, and current service visitors are an important set of stakeholders for us. And then briefly, if I may, on the right-hand side, this is our ECT display. Now, in our collections, we have maybe a dozen ECT machines, and in an early stage, museum consultants who came in to help us with the development of displays said, maybe we can pile them all up artistically, and we'll have a mountain of them, and that's the way visitors will encounter them. And we thought about that for maybe 3 seconds before realizing, what a nightmare. Why would you do that? So again, we had this line. Are we going to just display none of them because it's too challenging? Or is there a way we can do it, put ECT machine on display responsibly? And again, this is the relationship between the object and the place, the setting. Our setting is of a large mental health hospital, currently providing a range of mental health services. ECT is still in use on the site. Now, it's not in use in the way it was 50 years ago. A much smaller percentage than 1% of patients are subjected to this treatment. It is controversial, and yet it's ongoing. So we had an issue that was specific to our site and to our sense of place, which is, what are the considerations that need to be brought to bear if someone shortly before, that treatment, or a member of their family were to come in and see a display on ECT? Now, what we've done is, so just very briefly, sorry, what we've done is we've not left the sort of old ECT machine rusting from the 1950s there on its own to scare people. Alongside it, we felt it essential to put, you can't really see it in the display, but there's a rolling film where the practice of ECT is spoken about. The controversy is absolutely met head on. People who have had ECT in the past and in the present speak to camera, and there is a variety. Well, there's a disagreement, there's a clash of perspectives on that, and we felt that film was very, very important in the context of the place in which we are put.
Which, in fact, probably, one of the big things that came up there in the discussion, I suppose, on the point today is to destigmatize and look at that. And I just want to come to you, Jennifer, and discuss your project down in Waterford, if you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I started the Waterford Memories project really as a response to a delayed recognition that the building I was working in was the former laundry based in Waterford. It was also the former industrial school, which is on the same campus. When I started just looking into the history, I realized there was also a bakery on site that would bake the communion bread hosts, and there was no outward recognition whatsoever that this history existed, which was really quite shocking to me. So even though I was born in Waterford, I left when I was 5 and didn't move back until well into my adult years. So I kind of had this bizarre lens of both quite identifying as being a daughter of Waterford, but at the same time having this quite independent lens, having not been raised during my childhood years there. So for me, it simply is a moral stance on the fact that this is the history of the buildings, and if we are serious about our work in universities, interacting with the communities that we exist and work in, then this has to be a two-way, co-constructed street where we recognize that history. So for me, the buildings are a constant reminder of that past. They're not a thorn in the side, but an itch in the mind is the way I like to kind of describe it. So as you walk past it, you're kind of a little bit forced to remember the people that were there, what forces allowed these institutions to exist for so long. And in Waterford, the campus closed, I suppose, as a functioning sort of industrial school, Magdalen Laundry, in the early 80s, when it was purchased by the Waterford Institute of Technology. But I was really just simply driven the minute I realized the history of the buildings to market in some way. So the Waterford Memories Project was simply about platforming non-academic voices. I realized the irony in that, considering I was trying to get the project off the ground. But simply saying, here's a place that if somebody wants to tell their story of their lived experience, I will hold it for you. So the interviews that I facilitated were completely unedited. We didn't go for sensationalist headlines to advertise or anything like that. And it's become now an educational resource, and it's become that through co-construction with survivors of the institutions and simply saying, what do you want? Like, what do you want us to do with this project? Rather than what I think is a good idea through the lens of being a psychologist who's an academic. I just see that I am given a platform, my voice is a platform, my education is a platform, and it's how can I use that in a meaningful way that sits into public history. And if anything, I want to step more and more and more into the background of the project rather than stepping forward in it. And ideally, it will become less and less and less about me and significantly more about public engagement. So we've joined a movement called the Sites of Conscience, and it's an international network. Their website is phenomenal. So all over the world, huge variation in projects, but really looking at built heritage and using built heritage as that sort of itch in your mind to look in the past so that we can envisage a future. The only way we can dream is by looking back first and saying, this is what I love, or this is what I hate, or this is what we should do better. And when we talk about social change, it's retrospective first in order to look forward. We have to have that history. We have to have that accessible in order to really examine how to engage in good social change, inclusive practices and so on as we move forward. So to me, history is always about doing something better now, rather than only looking at this kind of temporal idea. So a lot of what we've done poorly in the past, we are doing poorly now. And that lack of reflection and reflexivity, I think, is one of the most exciting parts of public history, that it unapologetically addresses those lenses where we want to forget. So as a psychologist, I suppose my interest in memory around this project, and hence why it's called, instead of a histories project, a memories project, is I'm always conscious as well that buildings are heavily, heavily politicized, particularly when they represent contested histories. As we heard this morning, there isn't one history, there are plural histories. And we have this kind of innate need to remember and pressures to forget. And the pressures to forget might come from the government, they might come from our neighbors, they might come from our families. So we are constantly walking this line as we get through our lives between wanting to forget certain things that are difficult and traumatic, but needing to remember them to work through the process so we can move out the other side. Yeah. And history is no different to that friction. History is humans, right? So it's, and we haven't evolved significantly as humans in a couple of 100 years to move past that. So while buildings are structures, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about the people in the institutions, inevitably. And yeah, that's what I'm kind of hearing from, Manon's talk earlier as well. It's the people, it's the stories. That's what people are responding to in museums as well. It's that narrative, that human story that's there. So buildings are kind of infused with memories, and you were explaining the kind of the Bethlem, and it's even in the lexicon. But it's a building, but the word means something significantly more and more difficult.
And your project is quite online because it's a digital archive.
Yes.
But you mentioned just there that you have also is there some sort of significance on your buildings? I think you have a map, don't you, on your website that shows all the various different buildings?
Yeah, so we made the decision to digitize because buildings are also potentially losable. They can go on fire, they can be demolished. Somebody can decide in 50 years' time, we don't want to look at this and knock it down. And a lot of the site is not protected. So we aren't guaranteed that these buildings will stay or that they will look the way they look at the moment. So they're vulnerable. So hence why we've done a lot of digitization work, 3D modeling of the buildings. And it's also because, not everyone can access, can travel and get access to the buildings. So to be a little bit more diverse and to reach a more international audience, because as much as we wouldn't wish this history on anybody, there are consistencies internationally in how we behave and how we make decisions that will either stop these types of abuses or will continue to perpetuate them. So I think it's important that those networking events happen, because there is a tendency in Ireland to silo, right? We look at the mother-baby homes, we look at the Magdalen laundries, we look at the psychiatric institutions, and we're sort of telling the public, don't link these, because you'll see the systemic decisions that have perpetuated. Choices, not accidents, deliberate choices to restrict and to marginalize people. And you miss that if you silo. So part of a lot of these public history projects that I think is fantastic, and the emphasis, the Grange Gorman Histories.ie, I'll mention it again, just again, also waterfordmemoriesproject.com. So also if we're sort of trying to, this is really where the power of those networks come. And I was talking last night about how sometimes this work is really lonely and terrifying sometimes. And I started this project is much, much smaller than the very established projects like Bethlem and so on. And it is terrifying because I constantly question my role as the knower, and am I perpetuating the people who are actually the knowers being cast into the known, right? Because I then talk about them or write about them. So I'm constantly trying to balance that trend. But at the end of the day, if you're an academic, I have to publish in this area because it's part of my job contract. So even though it morally doesn't sit right with me, that is something that we have to just make visible. So I don't have the answers perfectly, but I think it's being honest with people. And that's a big part of I hear in a lot of this work as well is, public trust around, medical approaches, around psychiatry, around the government's responses is low. It's really low. That's not good for anybody. It's not good for healthcare. It's not good for, I suppose, treating mental health issues. So all of this for me is these lessons in the past shine a light on what's going on right now for people, and how we perpetuate institutions like direct provision. I mean, this is really directly comparative to what was happening in the laundries. Yeah. And a tendency towards institutionalization and a fear of anything that looks abnormal or outside normality. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet.
Yeah, very good points. I'm going to come to you, Denise, now, because actually you're really in the building space.
Yeah. But I like that phrase. I'm going to steal that, an itch in the mind for the buildings. Yeah. But I feel maybe as I get older, more comfortable in my space of doubt, and that now being doubtful and not knowing things is also a good thing. And because I've always really doubted, I don't know why I'm here. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm an architect. I'm a total generalist. But I suppose I come from the point of always looking at the legacy of our power structures and our, and society. And I see buildings as being kind of built narratives of who was in charge and who had the money and who had the power. And I come from a background of working really with communities in regeneration who would have been, I suppose, treated more as, service users, people who were numbers, and trying to give them voices and bringing them to the table, and then joining this project where, again, you're trying to give voice to the voiceless, but also trying to make visible the invisible. So you have these massive institutions all around the country that are very present and yet forgotten. So we're working on what we call the Invisible Buildings project of trying to map them. And that really came out of our project on Sean McDermott Street.
Can you go into a bit more about that? Yeah, just give a bit about
which,
the background.
again, I'm a tiny pawn in this, but so the Sean McDermott Street Magdalen Laundry was the last state-owned Magdalen Laundry and was due to be sold in 2018 to a Japanese hotel chain by Dublin City Council. And the councillors voted against that sale. So a collective was formed called Open Heart City, which included a lot of academics and archivists, who then asked the question, how do we act in this place? And then I came on board as part of a collective of architects. So it's myself, we've Plattenbau Studio and Catherine Blaney, and we've been working since 2019 on Sean McDermott Street initially about what was the future for that site. And thankfully in 2022 the government announced that they would make it a national site of conscience. And most recently, there was a public consultation online about what that meant. So that we don't really know exactly what's happening with those plans, but everything that was being talked about today about how to present those stories in a building. So it's different issues, but it's issues around carceral institutions because of being perceived as not normal or having stepped outside of the normal mores of society and then being incarcerated in large institutions. So I think what I find really interesting about today is this talk about fragmented stories and not presenting a cohesive narrative, because there isn't a cohesive narrative, and that presenting those multiple stories and how you do that in what will be the National Site of Conscience to remember all these survivors, many of whom, I think there's this narrative in Irish society that these people are really old. I mean, I work with a 30-year-old who was born in Bessborough. These people are very much part of our society, and there's intergenerational trauma as well. So this is not a dead story, and anyone who tells you that, is again trying to hide and bury and try to move on in some way. So what we're trying to do, I suppose, is from an architectural perspective, identify the sites at which these things happen, but it's a whole other discipline and people in this room who will bring those stories into focus within the institutions. But during the whole process, we had many consultations with survivors, and because it was COVID, we thought I was really looking forward to having really intimate gatherings with people and talking to them about their lived experience. But actually, because of COVID, we couldn't do that, and we did it online. But what was strange about that is that, like with your Waterford Histories project, bringing things together online makes it more accessible. So we had people from the States, we had people from the UK, we had people from Australia coming on calls who had never been able to talk about this because it was so dispersed, and no one in their communities in Minnesota or in Perth knew or could relate to this story. It was just so foreign. So there were people on these calls going, I've never met any of you and I don't know even where to start. And somebody sent something to somebody I knew, who sent me a link. And suddenly they were, for the first time in their lives, on calls with people. So I suppose what we're trying to do with the Invisible Buildings project is try and make those buildings visible, try and give a visible network to people that they can start to hopefully collect their oral histories, and try and bring this thing together that so many people have tried to silo, to break down, to make it less important. So
Can you just outline a bit more? I mean, you touched on it there before I interrupted and asked you to explain the Sean McDermott. The Invisible Histories one and the maps. You're going to be having an exhibition now this weekend, aren't you, up in Grange
Gorman, yeah.
For open house. Just give an overview of what that entails, a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I mean, none of us are academics, we're all architects doing this kind of in a slightly ad hoc way, so it's more of a proof of concept rather than a deep academic study. But what we've done is mapped the 360 odd institutions as reported in the Mother and Baby's Home, on a digital data set with the latitude and longitude, the date, the size of the site, the current owner, the original owner, if we know roughly how many people went through the institutions, but often that's not known. And what we're trying to do, I suppose, is create the information so policy can be built around it. So for instance, there's a site the size of the town of Athlone, owned. It's not, when you accumulate them, it makes up the size of the town of Athlone, and it's owned by the state, and it's on the edges of towns around Ireland. So if that doesn't tally with, housing policy and other things, like these are vast sites of a couple of hectares with, yes, some buildings on them, but often, mostly kind of dilapidated open space, and they generally have big walls around them, and they become, when you look at them on a plan, and that's what we've tried to do, I suppose, is illustrate where they are and how they're located and how they're connected to the town. But there's a gate and there's a wall and you can't get in, and they get forgotten about because no one's ever been inside in them. So we're trying to kind of highlight that. So we've looked at the 360, then 16 in a bit more detail, and then 4 where we've had to look at them again in a fragmentary way. So we've made a model of a piece, we've taken photographs from the outside, we've done drawings of what we can get access to, because we don't have a definitive record and there isn't a definitive story. So we're trying to look at it through multiple lenses to kind of scratch away at the surface. But again, it's very much a proof of concept early stage, but that work needs to be done. Whether it's us or somebody else taking it on, but we really need to understand the same level of detail that some of the institutions have been mapped, so we can understand what that asset, if nothing else, is that we can draw on and use.
One thing that struck me in Madame Parry's speech was towards the end, I had kind of a light bulb moment of the role of Grange Gorman Histories being about this. Their goal or their aim is to display some of the artefacts, and I know you've touched on that there now, Colin. But can maybe did anything like that come up with Sean McDermott Street? Did you have any kind of, when you were doing the outline plan for that project, did you have anything per se with regards to artefacts, or how that would be incorporated in the archive section or in the exhibition section? Or
I think there was just lots of different opinions. So some survivors want, the buildings burnt to the ground, and they'll pull up a chair to watch. And some survivors want it left, mothballed exactly as it is. Interestingly, we had 2 exhibitions, one in the chapel and one in part of the old convent. And we brought on a private tour some survivors, and there's a huge amount of preparation need. Like, they wanted to come, but when they got to the door, and it was just this kind of visceral reaction to the tiling on the floor, and just remembering having to scrub the tiles. Wow. And then the smell. So it wasn't anything to do with the exhibition, it was just the building itself, because we studied the building with 50 students from UCD, and we got in, it was just before COVID, and they drew and drew and drew the inside of the building, and then they reflected on what they had seen and drawn, and they were just talking, in a very simple way about the level of detail and materials and value that were put on the areas on the ground floor. And then as you went up through the building, it got simpler, and then when you got to the dormitories, it was very ordinary joinery used on the dormitory wing. And it was one big room with very plain finishes and much smaller windows. And yet, from the architectural conservation point of view, with Dublin City Council, were going to make the building a protected structure, but they weren't going to protect the dormitory wing, because it was from an architectural built fabric point of view, it was quite plain. But without it, the rest doesn't exist. Like, it's there, and the laundry had burnt down, but you can still see the footings of the laundry and the foundations. But so everyone has to constantly question, what are we valuing? Because the convent doesn't exist without the dormitory wing, and vice versa, and the altarpiece, and the way that is let out, and the more uncomfortable pews at the front versus the more substantial one at the back. They're all in them. You can see the social history. Yeah. So you kind of need it all.
Yeah. And the reclamation of that space, like, there's often a chronology of, in the 60s, the space was used in one way, that was altered in the 70s, altered again in the 80s, and that reflects the social history and the ethos of the religious orders that we can't access any other way, because they won't speak or talk or
release their records.
Yeah, exactly, or release records or anything like that. So when we're left with this absolute lacuna of a lens, we have to fill it in other ways. And actually the building, as you say, tells those stories for us. Very much similar with the tiles, and that's actually the logo that we use for the Waterford Memories project, are those tiles, for that exact reason, is that they're so, they're the one kind of symbolic piece of the building that so many survivors mention. And the chapel in Waterford, for instance, was originally designed. So we have records of the architect saying that the whole ethos was inclusivity and bringing the community into the chapel. And we know that when it was used, that the nuns made the decision to wall up the center points in the chapel so that the girls from the industrial school couldn't see the girls from the laundry and vice versa, and that they would never cross paths because the Magdalen laundry girls would contaminate the industrial school girls. So that's hugely important to know that, and we only know it because of how the building was used and the record of the building.
And again, similarly, as I said, you touched on the objects and artifacts, but bringing it back to the understanding the space and approaching it of, well, how are we going to display this, which is the challenge ahead for Grange Gorman Histories, is that they want to make sure that they sensitively approach the exhibition of these artifacts in the space of a university. Colin, would you like to start there?
I think place is so important, and even the reaction, I want to see the thing burned down, and I want to be there to watch it. That shows you that the place is important, that it does matter. And it can, and going back to what I said earlier, the place can shape the way objects are encountered. Actually, going back to the title of today, trigger warnings, we've found it unnecessary to date to give trigger warnings for our displays. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because, well, partly it's a matter of how one displays things, but actually also where they're displayed. And I guess no one is going to be surprised if they go to a museum of mental health history, a museum of the mind, and it's embedded on the site of a working mental health hospital. If you then see displays about mental distress, it's kind of like, it goes with the territory. It's not that surprising. We have given trigger warnings where we have done a temporary display that kind of touched on war trauma, okay? But maybe if that display was at the Imperial War Museum, for example, it wouldn't be necessary. Or if we'd done something with, sexually explicit materials. Well, if we're in the red light district of Amsterdam, we wouldn't need to do that, but in our context, we need to. So I kind of feel that in that way, place, as well as being important, helps to shape the way people encounter displays. And it can really enrich that, but it takes some thinking about how to do that in sympathy.
I'd like to come in on the triggers as well quickly. It really struck me what you were saying about actually it was the tiles that got people. And I mean, when we were preparing to display, how we were going to display the controversial objects, sorry, back on objects again, but particularly the straitjackets, the manacles, that sort of thing, we had some focus groups, which we called Confronting the Collections, and we got people to come and look at them. And actually, the contemporary service users that we were sharing these objects with, we gave them the opportunity to handle them, we passed them round, and actually, the general sense was that you don't want to whitewash things. These things need to come out, they need to be shown. So those things that we anticipated being quite triggering weren't. Now, I gave a talk at one point and I used as an illustration an engraving from the Illustrated London News that had been done in, I can't remember the date of it, but yeah, that's sort of late 1800s. And to me, it's quite a kind of comedy image. It's that kind of Victorian over-the-topness. So you've got this it's the sort of social space. It was the women's gallery, where people could mingle and be social. And it's sort of slightly comedic to me because it's very Victorian, so there's just too much stuff. You've got birds in cages and you've got plants and you've got, it's just too much. And I used the image and a lady got up and left very abruptly. And she came up later and apologised and she said, "I'm so sorry, it was rude of me to leave, but that image just the structure of the building and the space, actually, even though it's from a different century, it really reminded me of a hospital that I was treated in. So it's really hard actually to predict what the trigger is going to be, and you can put the trigger warnings out there, but it'll be sod's law. You'll put it up there for the wrong thing, and there's things that you don't anticipate, being particularly controversial that can really impact people.
I was going to say, I think it's your point on the managing the expectations. If you go to a museum that's labelled literally psychiatry museum, there's a certain expectation of what's going to be there, and also the current literature on trigger warning suggests that the trigger warning causes anxiety, not the thing itself.
Yeah.
So what you do is you promote a state of future anxiety on what the person is going to be confronted with. So they sort of treat it like they're walking into a house of horrors, and they're expecting to just be bombarded. And obviously, I mean, the vast majority of museums, are hopefully a little bit more sensitive, that they're not going for shock value. So yeah, that's the other side. So kind of content is maybe managing expectations. This is a museum. These are the types of displays we have. That's it. Versus a trigger warning.
Do you do something like that down in Waterford campus?
Because it's the website, and so before people access the oral history interviews, we have a pop-up kind of content warning rather than a trigger warning. And I suppose because we don't know who's accessing the website. So people are potentially coming with none of their expectations managed of what they're going to hear. And many of the oral histories will disclose, experiences of sexual violence, and maybe somebody isn't prepared. They're expecting to hear about institutionalized violence, but, So we do on the side of erring on the side of caution, but it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think sort of content warnings versus trigger is potentially a more realistic and less sort of potentially literally it kind of traumatizing somebody before they've even come into the space in terms of their expectations and what to see.
Yeah. Sorry, Denise, I cut across you there earlier.
No, that's okay. I was just thinking about the different spaces within Sean McDermott Street, and rather than objects, the building as an object, I suppose, that and how you use it, and how is there a kind of reflective relationship between use and design. So obviously this room has been designed for collective use, and that could be multiple types of collective use, whether it's a party or a lecture. And the chapel was designed for collective use, but the kind of iconography of the chapel is highly charged, and that because of the power structures between that ran the institution, there's obviously a conflict there. So one of the big questions is how the chapel will be used again. And I had a student last year exploring different ways of kind of cloaking the space in materials that would kind of hide but not completely hide the iconography. Because on the other hand, it's a really highly valuable craftsmanship that went into designing the space. So you have these things coming into conflict. And then you have the different scales of spaces. So you have spaces that were used for dining that are kind of, for 10, 15, 20 people. And then you have the nuns' rooms where you can see that you had individual space. So you can still see the sink and the mirror and the window, and it has one door and there are 4 walls. So that was a space for one person, whereas the dormitories were collective spaces. So is one way of marking the history just by how you continue to use those as collective spaces, individual spaces. How do you get that balance, I suppose, between not trying to recreate one frozen moment in time of fitting back out those spaces as they once were, and honouring the memory and the use of the place. So we haven't, I suppose, gone into that level of detail, but those are the questions that come to mind when you're thinking about how to reuse a building like that.
At the opening of the book launch last night of Brendan Kelly's book, it was one of his last points that he made in his speech, which I think was absolutely on point, obviously, is that building, the Richmond Hospital, set out with a very, very, I don't know, it was just, it was all good intentions, and along the way something went wrong, as he said in his last words. And I thought that was very interesting. I suppose the big thing now is that conversation that needs to happen between, everyone across the board that's working in this area, and trying to keep that momentum and build a network. Are you doing much work, Colin, in this field of like creating a network yourselves in the UK, or?
Yeah, so we're no experts, but we've gained enormously, Victoria and I and other members of staff at the museum, by contact. Coming over here, I was here in 2019, and it was immensely kind of like thought-provoking. And other partner European institutions, some of them which have been mentioned, and there are others as well. Not that we're going to any. Not that we think that, well, there's someone out there who has all the answers to these questions, because each of the contexts is slightly different, and that there's a local way of going about things that might be appropriate in one place, but not really map across to another. But it's just the opportunity to be exposed to those different nuances, different contexts, and to think to think through these together with other people who have grappled with some of the same issues. So there is no formal network, but less formally, it has been very, very enriching. And it's not a done deal either. The kind of conversations will go on, and our museum displays will have to be kind of overhauled to respond to new challenges and new reactions to what we've done in the past.
Yeah, sorry, Victoria.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the fact you said actually it can be quite a sort of isolating experience doing this sort of work, and certainly, when we were developing the new museum at Bethlem, we found it there were sort of several smaller psychiatric museums dotted around the UK, most of which were sort of at that stage of having been established by medical staff and very much being the sort of, here is a celebration of our wonderful, and one of them I think was actually named after a doctor at the Stanley Royd Museum, but it was, so although, they were sort of coming from a point slightly, they were certainly less well financed, and they didn't have the sort of luxury that we did of being on the point of having the funding to open a new museum. But actually, they were still doing that really important thinking and having the opportunity to speak with those colleagues down in Bristol in the southwest of England, in Wakefield up in Yorkshire in the north, and I also visited Dumfries in Scotland, where the Crichton. The Crichton Infirmary had an amazing art collection up there that I was able to go and visit. It is really helpful to know that you're not sort of working alone. And there were also museums that had also done sort of displays within larger museums, particularly the Lightbox in Woking, where you could actually, have those conversations. I think it's enormously important, whether those networks are formal or informal. I think it's really valuable. Yeah. No, as Colin says, nobody's got all the answers to this. It's far too complex.
Yeah, you agree.
Yeah, and I think that even more broadly, these institutions are our cultural heritage, just as much as the stuff that we slap on the front cover, come to Ireland as a tourist, please. Our heritage is significantly deeper, more diverse, more complicated. So the kind of the ownership, who has ownership to reclaim these spaces, is everybody. I mean, literally everyone in society has ownership. And even when we look at stakeholder groups like survivors, the general public, we use these labels. They're not homogenous groups, as you say. Survivors are not a homogenous group that all want the same thing in this lovely linear way. So the only solution I have at the end of it is that sometimes a decision has to be made. A museum has to open, an exhibit has to launch, it has to go forward, is to be as transparent as possible. So we're displaying one EEG machine, but actually we have 50 in the back. And you know what I mean? So so that way you're saying, here's one, but actually, look, this was prolifically used without bombarding, as you said, the example of them all stacked on each other. So it's not perfect, but it's the way of representing all of those different stakeholder lenses in one location, where we're not expecting visitors to get one lens and go off and figure out the rest of the lenses themselves. And if anything, the more we pull apart these processes, the more lenses there are. There's more voices, more interpretations, and so on. And all we can do is sort of is put a mirror up to it and say, there you go. This is it.
I suppose interpretation from where I come from is all about like that. You have the heal or harm pose. You're posing a question about the object, so you are trying to pose the question to the audience and the visitors.
And we do get forced into that binary, and I understand that that's not it. You're being much more nuanced than that, but this sort of idea of it's good or bad.
Yeah.
It was therapeutic, it was harmful, but that's also just not most people's lived experiences.
Yeah.
There's so much kind of embedded in that.
I find we had that with the stakeholders as well. So I remember quite early on in our consultation process, and I'd done a lovely feedback form, and it was, are you A service user, B, a member of staff at the hospital, C, a local resident? And someone came up to me and went, or 4, a museum professional. This lovely girl who I immediately bagged for our community panel came up and said, I'm actually all 4 of those. Which one would you like me to tick? And it's like, all of them, and can we have your email? Excellent, come on in. It's very complex. I think it was Manon mentioned earlier, and apologies if it wasn't you that mentioned it earlier, but actually a lot of people go into the world of mental health care because they are personally impacted by it, and this is something you see a lot of. People, want to train for medical professions because they've witnessed illness in their family or they've been unwell themselves. And, I think this is something that is, I don't think this is unusual. So I think, there's that sort of, as you say, people aren't a sort of homogenous group.
And I'll just drop in and say, our displays, we've tried very hard not to tell people what to think. And we've tried very hard not to, communicate a Whiggish sense of history as continual progress. And we've tried very hard not to be a hospital brochure, just simply extolling the modern and kind of like really bad-mouthing everything that happened in the past by way of contrast. So we've tried to hold open a space, genuinely a space for reflection and then of feedback. So we genuinely want to know whether what we have done kind of provokes further thought. And if it means that people come back and say, actually, that display, I don't like it, but it's actually part of a process whereby I consider a success when our comments books are filled not with your display was great, your display was not so great, but actually comments not about the displays, but about mental well-being, the difficult histories, we've been saying a lot today, deep reflection on the history and current practice in mental health care, and not about the museum.
I think you've done your job.
Do you want
a job that is ongoing.
I think that the way we were thinking about how the space at Sean McDermott Street might be used is really as an explorative space about the past and the future. And a lot of the survivors, they're really looking for their story to be acknowledged and told. And many of them kept saying, like, my grandchildren don't learn about this in school. Like, it's not in our primary school curriculum, because the research hasn't been done, the records haven't been opened, the stories haven't been told. So they're more interested in that. And then the building as a place where, school groups can go and learn about this part of our history in order to acknowledge that, we're not perfect, and that direct provision is a continuation of a similar type of system. And some people said, well, maybe it should be the site for the next citizens' assembly. So it's really about process and structures and democracy and non-hierarchical kind of top-down systems, rather than about, in their minds, trying to display and remember how life was in an awful institution. And I think that that's really what they wanted to be. They're not. It's not one cohesive group, so I shouldn't say they want to be. But the stories that I was kind of hearing were more about exploring the past through arts, like the Asylum Workshop, and being really enthusiastic about engaging with the current generation. And we're so amazed that the students we worked with in their 20s, cared at all about this past and this story. So really wanting to have a space where all those things could be told, and a space where the story is acknowledged, and those kind of systems and thought processes and structures are continued to be discussed, so that we don't repeat, I suppose, mistakes of the past. And just to say, I don't think that anyone thinks that the 300 odd sites should be all made into national sites of conscience. Like, there's way too much built space. But that, could we come up with a national policy that, like, say in Dublin City Council now having their development plan, that all large-scale residential schemes should have 5% of the floor area dedicated to community space. So if these were all assigned in policy and local area plans as national sites of social conscience, could there be some stipulation, like quite easily done, voted on by councillors at a local level, a system of survivor engagement and public consultation around what that might be, but that there's a social conscience engagement and memorialisation piece about the future of those sites. Because I think there's two things that's stopping the sites, I suppose, being redeveloped. One is that a lot of them have gone into quite a bad state of dereliction because of their past, and people thinking they don't know what to do with them. And now it's going to be quite expensive to bring them back to a point where they're usable. And the other is a fear exactly around this. What will people say? How will we engage with people? What will survivors say? How can we ever do the right? Everyone's going to say we're doing wrong. And so inertia creeps in, and people just don't want to touch it. Especially in a 4-year kind of election cycle. Like, who's going to be the person who's going to go out and advocate for this?
Exactly. Yeah. Actually, it's funny what you mentioned there about your students taking it on. A lot of the audience in Grange Gorman, obviously, who will be viewing these objects will be students, which is going to be an interesting take. Okay, well, I think that we will go into Q&A. Colin, Victoria, Denise and Jenny, thank you very much. It was really interesting. And yes, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to all your speakers. I was actually interested in what Jennifer was saying. She was describing herself as a psychologist and an academic. I'm an academic who's also a librarian. I was also born in Bessborough in 1964. And I do object to being called a survivor. I think it's a terrible word. I just deliver. I just get on with my life. But I would say, and I always think it's interesting, what will you do with the buildings? Because I grew up in Cork, and I remember there was an industrial school in Greenmount in Cork, and it was knocked down by a developer in the 1980s. And it had sat there for many years, and it was dying on its feet. And people did kind of object at the time, but it turned out that the developer himself had spent time in the industrial school. And when he left it, he vowed that one day he would burn the place down, and he did. And there was objections from people at the time. And then when they found out the history and his history, they kind of went, okay, you have a point. And I think there is that in it, because I like I said, I have my history with Bessborough. I met my mother for the first time 2 months ago in 59 years. And she spent 24 hours there, and I spent 48 hours there. So she couldn't even remember the name of the place she was in. But I do think that at the same time, I pass Bessborough now every so often, and it's all tucked away and it's locked away, and you can go in if you're forceful enough. But I just wonder, there is no, and I appreciate that there is no one size fits all when it comes to what you're going to do with the buildings. But I do think that there shouldn't be one size fits all when it comes to the buildings. I think each building has to be looked at individually, because each building has a different history, and you can't lump the industrial schools together with the laundries, together with the mother and baby homes, together with former hospitals and the like, because every single one of them is different, and they all have different histories, and they all have different impacts on the people who live even now today around them. So I do think that some sort of it's more than just talking to people who live locally. I think it's getting away from being a fear of the trigger warnings. I think sometimes you just have to put something out there and see what it brings back, rather than saying it would be ashamed to put that out there because it might cause a trigger. Have you come across any instances of that when you having carefully curated something that it has brought back some sort of a history or a trigger that you hadn't expected, but that was able to work to your benefit in the end?
I suppose, Victoria, do you want to start there?
I'm trying to think. I don't know if it was so I think I'm going to go back to the ECT machines, because we obviously displayed it in the end with alongside a film, but also with two pieces of art. And one of those pieces of art was quite interesting. So we used to run sort of fairly regular sessions where people would come. We worked very closely with the Bethlem Gallery, which is a contemporary occupational. It's a contemporary art gallery which has emerged out of occupational therapy, so it's sort of coming from a slightly different direction. And we would do these sort of regular sessions where people could were encouraged to create art inspired by particular objects. And somebody chose one of the ECT machines, and I thought, oh goodness, that's going to be quite interesting. And because I'm not an artist and I'm not remotely creative, and I knew this person was a ceramicist, I thought, that's going to be interesting. I wonder how she's going to create this structure out of clay. How's that going to work? Now, what she came up with was actually the most extraordinary, wonky cup and saucer. And the story that went with it was that actually her strongest recollection of undergoing ECT at the time when it was at its worst, it was doled out to everybody regardless of use or value, and quite a sort of industrial process, if you like. And her recollection is emerging from having received the treatment, being handed a cup of hot sweet tea, which in the NHS is the answer to everything. And clocking that this was actually quite an expensive cup and saucer, and she was incredibly wobbly and incredibly stressed out. And what added to her stress was, oh God, I'm probably going to drop this cup of tea, and it's a really expensive cup and saucer. So her whole artwork was sort of, and I think it's something we decided to incorporate into the permanent displays. And the artist very kindly donated it to us and sadly died just before the museum opened and never saw it in position, which was really sad. But that story of her trauma, I think, the fact that she chose to share it, and it then it became, incorporated into the museum, and I think really enriches the display of that particular object. I sort of realise I'm sort of slightly not, sort of half answering the question, but that was just the sort of example that came to me, really, that it's, something that was very, very, obviously very triggering that artist chose to, rather than say, oh God, I'm not even looking at that, she chose to embrace that object and revisit it and create something incredibly positive and beautiful out of that really negative experience.
I actually just heard on the radio this morning for World Mental Health Day, I was listening in to hear Brendan Kelly being interviewed about his new book, but just beforehand there was somebody who was describing their own experience, and they had been suicidal, and they received ECT treatment just in the last number of years, and it was the cup of tea after the treatment that she described. Wow. She couldn't remember her name when she came to after the treatment, and having that cup of tea and worrying about whether she could remember who she was, and this strange, discombobulating experience of the treatment. It was amazing. I just heard it this morning. Anyway, I am supposed to be giving it to other people to ask questions.
Hi, folks. Fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. So reflective, so empathetic. I'm just wondering, in terms of buildings, what are your thoughts on sort of preserving and depicting buildings that have been removed? I'm thinking in a Northern Irish context, for example, buildings that were bombed and then quickly towns reconstructed with new facades. But I think it was Braha Edinger who talks about, in a Second World War context, the places, the trauma that exists in places stays, even though the building has been blown up, the city has been rebuilt. And I think, even just thinking about toxic positivity, that idea of even in New York, the Freedom Tower, we're so quickly superimposing. I know for me, coming from OMA, for example, having that new facade built up, you almost forget the tiles. You forget the fonts of the shops, the shoe shops, and that kind of thing. So how do you construct an exhibition around what is no longer tangible? Is that something that we rely on through oral histories, now with technology, 3D imaging, or is that going too far, reconstructing?
Yeah. But there's been 3D reconstruction of Sean McDermott Street, because there's only a very small part of the site that's actually still there. So, Linda, if you want to take that.
Yeah, there's in Queens, there's a part of the network working on the Lost Rooms project, so making 3D reconstructions of interiors, actually, mostly. And then the idea being that it would be a kind of a vehicle for discussion and collection of oral histories. But again, I suppose there's questions around that, and I'm not sure how far forward they are with doing the oral histories part of, would you, if you had spent time working in that laundry, want to put on a headset and, take a virtual tour back through a space? But yeah, but people are using all these tools to explore, what is the right thing to do. With the Invisible Buildings project that we're working on, some of it's about making things that are there visible, but there are a lot of them that have been demolished. And I suppose all we're doing is kind of raising the questions like, how do you memorialize places? So we've looked at different case studies, like should there be a marker on every site that ever was? In broad brush terms, there are three types of sites. There's kind of the derelict, there's the in use, and there's the demolished. So obviously there's every kind of facets in between, but so there are lots of them that are in use, like the College of Art and Design in Limerick is a former Magdalen laundry, but there isn't really any acknowledgement of that history. It's similar to Waterford. And then there's places that are non-existent anymore, or there's very small, even houses. There's a house on, is it Ansley, not Shelburne Road, the other one. Anyway, one of these big old kind of embassy houses that used to be a mother and baby home. So, should there be a plaque at least acknowledging that in every single place? But then back to the fact that these were the bigger institutions, but there were foster homes and there was boarding out, and it was a really decentralized thing. So how do you mark all those places? And we haven't been able to capture, I suppose, those smaller scale spaces. So, I think there's an opportunity. Our kind of end goal with the mapping is to have, an open source map with all these institutions mapped that people can add in information to. That's much more complicated than it sounds, like the vetting of all that information, but it would be like a kind of centralized repository for all the oral histories. People have so many artifacts that they want to share, whether it's pictures or objects that they have. But hopefully with the establishment of the National Site of Conscience, that can become, not just the place, but the institution or the vehicle or the group of people who can begin to bring all these strands together, because it's very hard when there's, all of us pulling at little threads. It would be nice to have somewhere to go and meet.
Yeah, because we're kind of replicating the siloing in our individual projects. And so always kind of conscious of that as well, is to have that locatable space, because there is a project, I think it's in Australia, where they have an absolutely phenomenal kind of one devoted website that brings in all of the information that's been collated by independent researchers, people with lived experience, et cetera, but it's just locatable in one place. And you can then click on the individual locations and be brought to the other projects. So it doesn't subsume the projects, but simply it's Google for these institutions. Essentially, it's that initial point. So it still allows for the separation. The point you're making, that these institutions, while related, were very separate and they functioned separately. It allows for both of those lenses to be recognised, that certain institutions behaved in different ways, but yet were interlinked. So it's, but yes, with the technology, I have similar. The next step in technology is the VR tours, where you walk the buildings. You can literally take the book off the wall and access that exact book in a digitized form. I get it, and I think it's it does wonders for things like archives where it's textually based and it's less really emotive and currently contested and all of that. So maybe in another maybe 10 or 20 years that might be a solution, but it feels slightly wrong to me and I can't exactly put my finger on why. But look, as you say, that might change. In 20 years' time, people coming behind us might think about things very, very differently. And we'll be the old voice complaining about, the way it's being altered. So that's a lived archive, isn't it? We want lived archives. We want people to access them however well they'll access them. So if the generation behind us don't have the ethical conundrum that I can't really name, but I feel, then that's part of that as well,
I think it's a caution about sort of I'm thinking,
Disneyland.
I'm thinking of the first two Bethlem sites where actually it would be quite hard to recreate them because we don't know. I mean, the first site particularly, we don't know enough about it really. I mean, we can see it on maps, but it's there's a blue plaque marking it where the site of it was, and I don't know if the second site has a blue plaque actually. Now the third site is an interesting one because a large part of the hospital is still there. There were two wings that were demolished, but the main part of the hospital is much more famous now as the Imperial War Museum. It's a major London landmark. So it's quite interesting trying to get across, trying to remember that hospital history. And we had various conversations, didn't we, about, whether there was a little gatehouse that could be used to actually, look at that history. And I mean, it's a sort of weird thing because you've got this building that proudly has this inscription saying it was refounded by Henry VIII and this sort of thing. Two massive military naval guns at the front, and the Imperial War Museum was founded at the end of the First World War. So it's a very sort of odd thing, but it is just so very famous as a landmark. We did things like for London Open House, we arranged tours up to the I think it was the old library, which had been the hospital chapel and that sort of thing. But that current, the current use and fame of that building is always, it's always going to make it very difficult to explore the previous history of that space.
Even one more question down here. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. I suppose I'm asking if, the buildings are so emotive and powerful, if by changing the name, can you change a use? Because most of the old hospitals now or the asylums are either offices. I know there's in Kerry, it's a hotel. So by actually changing a name, are you changing the significance of it? Because if you mention to somebody, I know somebody who was there or I was there, it's not taking away their experience, but it sometimes feels that, we'll change the appearance, the name, so that will change the history. There's so many things from what was said this morning. It's like in the research or in the exhibitions, do you go into explaining how it evolved, how ECT came about, how the building came about, why a particular institution came about? And is that a way of looking at the past and saying, okay, this is how it evolved? These are the mistakes, or these are and prevent us from doing the same thing again? In terms of, you've mentioned the asylum, and the asylum, I can't, sorry. No, the asylum centres.
Yeah.
Instead of repeating the new, how do you go about challenging the past and not dismissing what people have experienced? And when you just mentioned the VR, I'm like, oh my God, there's no way somebody can understand what it was like being in a hospital by putting on a headset unless you were there. Yeah. You do not know what it's like walking down corridors unless you were there.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that? Thank you. It's such a great question. I certainly recognise that phenomenon of let's change the name and then we'll kind of disconnect from all that history. Of course, if practice doesn't change, then that we get into cycles on that. And the new, even that word asylum was adopted in the early 19th century, as a squeaky clean, really positive, aspirational, in the terms of refuge, right? Asylum seeker. And then in the early 20th century in Britain, hospitals started to say, well, we're going to rename ourselves. We don't want to be associated with what asylums had come to represent. So we'll call ourselves mental hospitals. No one can object to that term. Obviously, I think if the use changes, it's very often that the name will change. The memory of the former use, though, I don't think will ever quite go away, for as long as there are people with memories and stories to tell that are listened to. There's a bit more on my mind to say about this, but I've temporarily lost my track. So if someone wants to come back in.
Well, I think just with imagining new uses for buildings, I think as long as it's not with the intent of wiping out, the memory and the stories, I think you can. And I suppose I think there's another part of it which isn't so much anything we've talked about today, which is the actual built fabric and the sustainability side of these huge structures that have huge amounts of embodied energy in them. And every single building we look at is has huge amounts of value in it just on pure material form. So we can't just knock everything down, even if it has no architectural value. We have to assess everything and decide what the best thing is to do with that building. But I think it's to start from a place of not saying that you're trying to wipe the slate clean, and that's easier said than done. But if we know that we don't need those institutions, but those institutional buildings are there, and we want to reimagine new uses for them, then it probably does mean a change of use, in the same way that Grange Gorman is now occupying the former Richmond asylum in parts. But I think with a way of not trying to wipe out the past.
Anyone else? One last. Do we have time?
Yeah,
Maybe we should.
just one more. Maybe.
One more.
Yeah.
Done.
Sorry, thank you. I think there is a way to balance the kind of extreme of the VR experience. And I'm seeing it as an extreme myself in 2023. I'm sure other people don't think so necessarily in the future. To balance that, but also to meet people where they are. And while we don't want to underestimate our audience, we also don't want to assume that everyone can imagine and extrapolate from the material and the stories that we share with them. So I think there is a benefit to considering displays of, time capsules in spaces. So like a dormitory bed, without sensationalizing it, without adding extra layers that don't necessarily need to be there. Have you considered that in a kind of a stripped way, perhaps, or in a more in a way that engages other senses, things like even smell? Is so important in some of these spaces.
I'd say we haven't permanently done something like that, but back in 2015, we ran an event similar to involving the theatre studies and performance students that we saw this morning. And we had students create art installments as well as live performances dotted all throughout the campus. So the public came in. So it was really about bringing the public into the space that, of course, had been surrounded by a high wall, smack in the centre of town, but no one's actually been in the buildings. And that sort of, everybody knows the buildings and refers to it as the Good Shepherds, but yet very few people have actually been on the campus itself. And one of the artists used carbolic soap in her artistic sort of response. And it was difficult for a lot of survivors, but at the same time, it was the question that we had earlier, like, so has anything ever been used that sort of was really triggering in the moment, but in the long run worked out? And we were stuck constantly with the ethics of this. I mean, it was every artistic response was potentially unethical, but also potentially very ethical, depending on what lens you used. So we were kind of thinking, oh my God. So it's not a permanent thing, obviously, that you smell carbolic soap, but it's such a strong memory trigger for people with lived experience. And for people in the community that would walk past the wall, they would smell the carbolic soap. So while they didn't have lived experience inside that wall, that was their association and a sense association. And it goes back to buildings, place, memory, all of those kind of things. So I wouldn't stand over doing something like that as a permanent exhibit. But in that event and what was trying to be done, so another artist had cut out children's footprints and mapped them on the floor of the pathway that the children would have been brought into the chapel to avoid the girls. So, and in my experience, creative people get there well before anybody else. They are trying to respond and make sense of the unsensible, for a made-up word, and are trying to figure this out and put meaning around stuff that doesn't make sense. And so this is where I think that the power of art and senses is there. But as we move forward, we have to layer that then with archival data, with the information and the facts and all of that. And it's the interaction of all those. So that's a halfway of answering your question, but I'll go to the...
We're very short in time. Just
Colin,
I know you wanted to jump in.
It reminds me of what you say of the Roald Dahl Museum, where there's a 6-foot block of chocolate and the smell of chocolate through the rain. But coming back to the previous question, because I think it actually relates to both. At Bethlem, we had the materials, we had all the sections needed, and the door as well, to reconstruct, if we wanted to, a padded cell, right? So in which someone could go in, shut the door behind them, 3 minutes later come out, having had the padded cell experience, knowing just what it was like to have been in a padded cell, except that they wouldn't. Of course they wouldn't. No way they'd know. And, they'd come out, I guess, with all of the kind of tabloid conceptions about the close association between mental ill health, violence and danger reinforced. So we didn't want to do that. So again, it's about walking a line. I love those footprints through because that does it, and I think people can get it. So we have sections on padded cell on display, and we've put them in an area where they're juxtaposed with open views of the hospital, beautiful hospital grounds. And we don't explain it. We trust people to get it and to make their own associations and to think more deeply about, in that case, the juxtaposition between freedom and constraint in a hospital context.
I think we're going to go break for lunch and see you after. Thank you very much, everybody in the panel.